thorough. In fact, she's probably better than most of us as academics. She's diligent, she's thorough, and she's engaging. And I'm sure that her message that she gives today, provided the technology holds up, will resonate with us all here. So on that note, Naomi, I'd like to pass straight over to you, please.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be able to be part of this gathering. I hope you can hear me better than I hear you. Can you hear me okay? Wave. Yeah. I want to extend a special thank you to Kevin for your tremendous leadership. It's a quiet kind of leadership, but I think you pushed us all to think more deeply, to work harder, to work faster, and this gathering is really a testament to that. So thank you, and thank you for including me. If I'm a little scrambled, it's because I planned on spending my morning polishing up my remarks, but instead I turned on the live stream. And I was quite riveted by the earlier speakers. It's a good thing that I listened, because I actually thought I was going to be the first one to call for global revolution, but it turns out that this has already happened 6 times today. So that's very good to know. There's such deep expertise in the room, and as you know, I'm very much a generalist. So, you know, and I come to this from the political side. So I've thought about what I can realistically contribute to the very sophisticated discussion that's going on here today. And I think that the main thing I have to contribute is just to underline a really simple message, which is that transformative policies of the kind we're discussing must be backed by transformative politics. Put another way, an agenda capable of delivering radical emission reductions will only advance if it is accompanied by radical movements demanding its advancement, while simultaneously defeating the agendas that stand in our way. The task, therefore, is not simply to lay out the right policies, although it's certainly that, but also to create an ideologically enabling atmosphere for those policies to flourish. So it's not just to lay out a radical plan, but to use collective power, political, cultural, intellectual, and economic power, to shift the dominant worldview to support and sustain that plan. I think that's the grand task for all of us, not just you in the room. And we need to be very clear about that task, because I believe that the single greatest barrier to the adoption of serious and effective carbon reductions thus far has been the worldview that currently dominates in the halls of power in virtually every country in the world, certainly in every high-emitting country in the world. I want to stress that it's not simply that climate action threatens the individualistic and dominance-based worldview of the right-wing nut jobs at the Heartland Institute, as well as the bottom lines of the fossil fuel companies that fund so much of their so-called research. Of course, it threatens the bottom line of the fossil fuel companies. Of course, it threatens that extreme worldview. But the real problem is that that worldview and those interests happen to rule our world, and have done so with dramatically increasing hegemony since the so-called free trade era began. So it's easy to laugh at the deniers, and I've done my share, because they are so transparently defending their rabid free market ideology against the challenges posed by climate science, which call on us to shred the free market ideology and take collective action in the public interest to strongly regulate private interest and radically strengthen the commons. But that overlooks the fact that their rabid free market ideology is not marginal, but is in fact dominant. It is the language of both corporate and political power. Those of us who believe that it is both possible and preferable to strongly intervene in the market and control emitters, to democratically forge economic plans for the long term, who believe in the principles of global equity and historical responsibility, are in fact the marginal ones. That is not to say that those ideas are not popular. Indeed, they are some of the most popular ideas in the world, but they are not powerful. They are not dominant. They are not winning, which is why translating popular into powerful is the true task ahead. It is the precondition for turning the radical plan emerging at this gathering into radical action in the real world. Now, obviously, that's a very tall order, and I want to stress that I'm not saying that it is the job of climate scientists, engineers, or even social scientists primarily to lead that kind of radical change. We need you to be doing exactly what you're doing, telling us, without the sugarcoating, how deep and rapid emission cuts need to be, and mapping out the concrete policies that could get us to those targets. And it's right that those policies sound impossible in the current ideologically shackled political environment in which we all operate. Because that's where mass political movements come in. Movements shift the sense of what is politically powerful, and they can often shift that sense very, very rapidly. This is why I've been so critical of some of the large green groups, particularly in the United States. I think their greatest error was the decision, often a very deliberate decision in the 1980s, not to confront the ideology that was rapidly advancing through Reaganism and Thatcherism, but to get on board with that ideology and adapt their ideas, their campaigns to that seemingly unmovable reality. So if the culture was shopping obsessed, then green would be all about buying the hottest new green products. If the culture was celebrity obsessed, then celebrities would be the spokespeople for climate change. If markets were all powerful, then surely markets would provide us with all of the solutions. This has been the strategy thus far, and it has failed spectacularly. It has not only failed in terms of lowering our emissions, but it has actively reinforced the values and ideas that are our greatest obstacles, particularly the idea that there is no alternative, that there is no such thing as society, that we are simply a collection of our self-interested consumer desires. That image of ourselves has been reinforced by some of the very groups that should have been challenging it, should have been putting forward a different worldview. There are a lot of different theories about why climate action has failed to lower our emissions in the quarter century in which we have been talking about this issue in the mainstream. There is validity to all of the theories. The UN, sure, it's dysfunctional. It's awfully hard to get 190 countries to agree on anything. And then we have all the human nature arguments. We can't think in the long term if it isn't an immediate threat. We are hardwired not to take it seriously. And you all are familiar with these rationales for our failure. But I actually think that we don't talk enough about what has been the greatest obstacle, the greatest barrier. And that has simply been bad timing on the part of climate change. Historically, ethically bad timing. And I say that because, I don't think we have spent enough time really reckoning with the fact that the climate coming out moment, if you will, was 1988. That's when James Hansen testified before Congress. That was the turning point, certainly in terms of a popular understanding of this issue. That was the year that the editors of Time decided that their man of the year was planet Earth, and they put a bruised and battered planet on the cover of Time magazine and said, this was the mission of humankind. And a few months later, the Berlin Wall collapsed. And history was being declared over. And this vicious era of deregulated capitalism was upon us. And the first free trade deals were being signed. At precisely this moment, the free Canada-US trade deal being negotiated in 1988. Then NAFTA, signed into law in 1993. Then the World Trade Organization, created in 1995. This is the key era when the UNFCCC was getting off the ground, when the parameters of what climate action would become, were being hashed out. And it's clear that the people who were drawing up those rules had no idea about what was coming. And you can see that in the way emissions are accounted for under the UNCCC. The fact that transport emissions, for the trade of goods, are not attributable to any country and are not really covered under the current negotiation. Or the fact that we account for emissions based on where they're produced as opposed to where they're consumed. All of this is a sort of pre-globalization mindset. And the climate negotiations and the trade negotiations have proceeded along these parallel tracks, kind of two solitudes that have failed to communicate with each other. And the people in the climate camp, in the climate silo, really failed to notice the ways in which trade was undermining and trumping climate at every turn. And I want to just give a couple examples of that. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, and as you know, my mayor smokes crack unapologetically, which is actually not the only interesting thing about Toronto, though that is the only thing that we get any attention for these days. We have actually, the province of Ontario has something called the Green Energy Plan, which is in North American terms, quite a visionary climate program. It's not perfect. But one of the things it has is a very sensible buy local provision that requires that wind and solar projects in the provinces of Ontario actually deliver jobs and economic benefits to the local community. Now that principle is the core of a just transition of the kind that Andrew has talked about. And it's really important in terms of breaking the deadlock of the jobs versus the environment debate that has been so damaging and been such a great obstacle to climate action, particularly here in North America, because the unions won't get on board. So it's very important, it has been very important, in order to get the unions on board, to provide jobs in this new economy, to show that yes, there are going to be some job losses, but there are also going to be some job gains. So that was a very important political necessity here in Ontario to get this package passed. But now what's happened is that the World Trade Organization has decided that this measure is illegal, that it's protectionist, that it's discriminatory against foreign corporations because it has this built-in local preference. And in a similar case, the U.S. challenged China's subsidies to its wind power industry, despite the fact that, unlike its solar industry, most of China's wind turbines were for domestic use. So we're actively helping China to get off coal, which we obviously all have a vested interest in doing, and yet the rules of the WTO were used to challenge China's subsidies for its wind industry, and that was ultimately settled by cutting those subsidies. Another example from my country about how the rules of trade are a threat to what we need to do. The province of Quebec banned fracking, which was a courageous move born of courageous activism. It's something a lot of us in Canada are very pleased about. It's been upheld by successive governments, but now a U.S. drilling company has announced that it plans to sue Canada for $250 million under NAFTA's Chapter 11, which protects investors against discrimination. claiming that the ban interferes with its, quote, valuable right to mine for oil and gas under the St. Lawrence River. Now, I believe that we should have seen this coming. A World Trade official was quoted almost a decade ago saying that the WTO enables challenges against, quote, almost any measure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, just because these measures can be challenged doesn't mean that those challenges will be successful. But what it does mean is that all kinds of good policies can get bogged down and slowed down at exactly the moment when we all need to leap and when we need to be moving quickly. So it's important to understand how trade policy is acting as a countervailing power. But I think far more important than the specifics of any individual case is just that these trade deals are an expression of neoliberal ideological triumphalism, right? They are an assertion of the pensée unique, of the idea that there is one way to run the world, and that is deregulation and privatization and the kind of austerity policies that are ravaging your country and are ravaging so much of Europe right now. That anything public and collective is suspicious, that anything market-driven is preferable. Now, as we know, this ideology has taken a beating since the financial crash of 2008, and Kevin and Alice have rightfully pointed out that if there is ever a moment in which to advance a radical plan flowing from the science, it is this moment when that ideology sort of lies bleeding on the floor and has discredited itself, broken its own rules, required these trillion-dollar bailouts. It's not in very good shape. But that said, it's trying to stage a comeback. And I know that as climate experts, all of you were watching Warsaw very, very closely, and probably were not very pleased about the agreement that came out of Warsaw, but not surprised, no doubt. And it's important to pay attention to the cost, but I think equally important to all of our work is what just happened in Bali over the weekend, which is that the World Trade Organization kind of came back from the dead, zombie style, right? And the head of the World Trade Organization was so pleased about this that he broke down in tears at the press conference, declaring that they had put the world back in the World Trade Organization. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, notorious for aggressively blocking every attempt at climate action in the United States, was positively euphoric over the weekend, praising the deal for, quote, streamlining the passage of goods across borders by cutting red tape and bureaucracy. They estimate that this will lead to an additional $1 trillion worth of trade. And of course, the type of trade that we can expect is precisely the type of trade that has sent emissions soaring since the year 2000, the year that China joined the WTO. And as I've been doing this research and doing this tracking, it's been really striking to me and my researchers how hard it is to get really good information. And I know that some of the people who are doing the best research about the relationship between trade and emissions are in that room right now and are presenters at this conference. But there's a lot more work to be done in bridging these two solitudes between neoliberal trade and climate policy. So once again, I think in terms of what we can expect from the WTO successfully coming back from the dead, it's less about the particulars of the deal that was signed in Bali and the fact that the Bali deal is being greeted as a resurgence for this particular worldview, for this market triumphalism that has gotten us into so much trouble. And it has to be seen as part of a package where we're now confronted with a flurry of very ambitious trade deals that include the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the U.S. and the EU, which according to the European Commission will be the biggest trade deal in the world, the proposed China-EU bilateral investment deal, the talks of which just launched this month. And Canada has already signed a similar deal with China. It has yet to be ratified, but unfortunately, so long as we have a Tory majority, that's something of a fait accompli. And then we have the Canada-EU deal also coming up fast. And those two deals with Canada are really important in terms of our prospects for stopping expansion of the tar sands, for the same reason that this U.S. company has been able to challenge the moratorium on fracking in Quebec, right? I mean, we in Canada, in the climate movement, are fighting very hard for a moratorium on tar sands expansion. And many of you in Europe are fighting very hard to keep tar sands oil out of Europe. Now, these trade deals could present significant obstacles to that because China can assert its investor rights to keep that oil flowing, and Canada can complain to Europe and say that we are being discriminated against because you won't take our dirty oil. So we need to see this stuff coming. We need to draw these connections, and we need to bridge the divide between the people who are focused on trade and the people who are focused on climate. And that's really about building genuine social movements. I think a lot of our problems have to do with the siloing of politics, the NGOization of politics, where everybody just has their little area, they keep their heads down and don't see those connections. So, once again, I think the stakes around this are really about the ideology underneath the worldview. And this is why I think if we cast our minds back to the last major WTO push and the huge protest against it in Seattle and that so-called anti-globalization movement that really exploded onto the world stage and was kind of cut off on September 11th, came to a sort of rude stop in North America and Europe, though it continued in Latin America and other parts of the developing world. I think we should think about what was working in that moment, and most importantly what was working is that the trade deals were being used as an opportunity to put the worldview and the ideology on trial, to put the worldview that puts profit above people and the planet on trial. And I think we need to recapture some of that movement energy if we're going to win these big climate battles. Because this is ultimately about values. You know, we can talk all we want about equity, but if we have a society that believes in ruthless individualism, we're never going to have climate policies based on the idea that all human lives are of equal value. So we need to be asserting that, not just confronting this failed worldview, this dangerous worldview, but asserting a different worldview, asserting a different relationship with one another and with the planet. And, you know, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, and maybe we can talk more about it in the discussion. But as some of you know, my last book, The Shock Doctrine, was about how crises have been systematically used by corporations and the politicians that do their bidding to advance this ruthless agenda against the popular will. And the last chapter of the book was about Hurricane Katrina, and it extrapolated from what happened in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, where you had this kind of system of climate apartheid, where if you had money and resources, you were able to get in your car and drive out of the city, but if you depended on the state, you were abandoned, left, you know, on the roof of your home holding a sign that said help, and no help came. And then the crisis was used by the neoliberal think tanks in Washington to push for further deregulation, further privatization of the public sphere, and actually they even used it to push for more drilling of oil and gas and more refinery capacity, saying that they needed the jobs and they needed more energy security. So it made absolutely no sense that here was a crisis that was created by heavy weather, the kind that we can be expecting much more of because of climate change, intersecting with weak public infrastructure neglected after decades of neoliberal policy, and the solution that was proposed and in fact enacted was to further weaken the public sphere, to further privatize the public sphere, and to drill for more of the stuff that underlies the climate crisis. But what's really striking in retrospect is, where were the Greens? Where were the progressive forces saying New Orleans should be rebuilt green? New Orleans should be rebuilt entirely on renewable energy. New Orleans should become a beacon of another economic model that is an answer to this failure. In other words, where was the people's shock doctrine? And, you know, I think if we don't use this crisis to put forward a deeply democratic, egalitarian alternative in response to climate change, then as we already heard, this, well, it was very early morning for me. I don't know what time it was for you. But climate change will be an opportunity for a kind of eco-fascism and a fortressing of continents, of neighborhoods, of classes, really. And at the same time, it will be an opportunity for tremendous profit, at least in the short term. You know, in the long term, yes, economies will be decimated, but in the short term, there'll be tremendous amounts of money to be made through land grabbing, through the patenting of seeds, of so-called climate-ready seeds, through the privatization of water. I could go on and on. We know what this dystopic future looks like. In fact, we've imagined it so many times in our disaster movies that I think we can't actually imagine the alternative. That's what our real problem is. It seems relevant to me that this morning, as we meet, as we gather, tens of thousands of people are gathering in Soweto for the memorial of Nelson Mandela. About an hour ago, I saw that Barack Obama had been speaking at the memorial service for Nelson Mandela, and he quoted that famous Mandela line, "It always seems impossible until it's done." I think it's useful to think about how South Africans got it done to the extent that they did get it done. And it wasn't by waiting for leaders like Obama to do it for them. It was by building new configurations of counterpower, street power, labor power in the factories and the mines, divestment power targeting the corporations that were profiting from apartheid, consumer power boycotting those corporations, cultural power through music and art. Just an explosion of culture was part of the anti-apartheid movement, as many of you remember. And finally, all of this forced the political power. That was the last stage. That was the last piece to come. All of this was powered by a clear moral vision of the alternative that was being fought for. It wasn't just an anti-racism movement. It was a movement for building that rainbow nation that the ANC articulated, and also the egalitarian society that was democratically decided upon during the apartheid years, for basic rights to be protected, but also economic rights for the redistribution of the wealth that had been amassed under apartheid. And that's the unfinished business of the liberation movement. And that is why so many people say that economic apartheid continues even as political apartheid ended. And where the revolution stumbled was when it took its eyes off the ball and trusted that leaders had it all in hand. That's when bad deals that sustained that economic inequality were locked in. I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn when it comes to climate, because we really don't have any leaders. You know, Ban Ki-moon has called for a climate leaders summit in New York this coming September. But I think the message in the face of that should be that we have no climate leaders. Or if we do, they most certainly aren't the leaders meeting at the United Nations. The good news is that there is a movement rising, and it's a movement that is much more in the spirit of the anti-apartheid struggle than the kind of green politics that we have seen since the 80s. I see multiple signs that climate activism has entered this radical new era, joining forces with new and powerful allies who have much to gain from a radical climate action plan, while severing ties with polluters who were never allies to begin with. There's a new generation of climate activists who understand that the task is not to politely lobby for whatever seems politically possible without upsetting the powers that be. They understand that it's about leaving the vast majority of proven fossil fuels in the ground, proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground, and fundamentally challenging the priority of growth and profit above all else. They also understand that there's no more time to waste, that the U-turn must begin now, not in 2020, not in 2050. You can see the shift in the explosion of genuinely grassroots, community-led direct action at the site of carbon extraction, whether it's tar sands, whether it's coal, whether it's fracking, confronting those interests at the site of extraction, at the site of transportation, and at the site of combustion. This is a movement animated by the belief that protecting local landscapes from poisoning is the best way to protect the global atmosphere from catastrophic climate change. We're also seeing very exciting new coalitions, particularly between climate activists, traditional climate activists, and indigenous groups whose land rights make them some of the most powerful countervailing forces to this extreme era of extraction. This is a movement that's not about arcane financial shell games. It's about keeping the carbon in the ground, out of the pipelines and the rail cars now. And I can tell you as a Canadian that this movement has the Alberta tar sands running scared. You can see the shift in the incredible rise of the fossil fuel divestment movement, which has already spread to hundreds of campuses in North America, which has recently launched in Australia and Europe, which is engaging faith communities, pension funds, dozens of cities. And these groups are taking on, these new activists are taking on the groups that still proudly display their partnerships with BP and Shell and turning those groups into pariahs. It's explicitly modeled on the anti-apartheid divestment movement, and it's already clocking in its first victories. Some very large North American cities, including Seattle, have announced their intention to divest from fossil fuels. Now, I think what's crucial about this movement is not that it's going to bankrupt Exxon and Shell. What's crucial is the way in which it is sparking the discussion about worldview, about what matters, about what profits are odious, about what is more important than profit. And young people have been a very, very important moral voice in this. You also see this new movement in the deep interrogation of the true cost of growth, that the conversations are happening from Berlin to Beijing. And I think the discussions around the cost of economic growth, the tremendous health costs that are happening in China right now, are a cause for real hope. But this is not Copenhagen. This is not the kind of hope that waits for leaders to save us. It's a movement that is genuinely leading from below. So just in conclusion, I'd say that rest assured that there is a movement bubbling up that is poised to take your most radical ideas and run with them. Because one of the most serious barriers to that grassroots activists continually face is the relentless claim by their opponents that this lousy way of powering our economy is in fact the only way. A radical plan that proves that there's a better way will not be an academic exercise. You can be sure of that. It will be much needed ammunition in the most critical battle of our time. Thank you so much for your work.
Well, thanks very much for that, Naomi. Can you hear me over there? Can you hear me, Naomi?
I can hear you. It's a little garbled, Kevin, so...
That's just the way I speak.
Okay, it's actually pretty good. I think if you stay close to the mic and repeat the questions, it'll work.
Okay, right. Well, firstly, I just want to thank you for that. That was a real tour de force, contextualizing climate change in perhaps a different way to many of us think. I mean, you contextualize it in terms of understanding issues of trade and values, and the upbeat part for me was to make the popular powerful. I'd never thought of it like that, actually. There is actually there's a lot of common views about making things different, but actually that we have no power. So actually that gives us scope, I think, for trying to see a way forward, that many of us already have shared views, but at the moment we're not powerful, and we have to find some way of becoming powerful. But I don't want to take up any of the time, really, because I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions here. So I will take 2 questions at a time. Please make them short, succinct and clear, and then I'll relay them to Naomi if she can't hear them directly from the floor. So we've got one here from Maya, and another one over here as well, from Kate, I think.
Ms. Klein, like this whole audience, I think we're very impressed with what you have had to say. But I have one major reservation. You refer to what Mandela has said about things becoming possible if you have, in effect, faith in them. Obama's view also is that the phrase he used for his election 5 years ago, yes, we can. In this instance, we can't. I challenge you to say how the process of climate change, which is melting, for instance, the Arctic ice cap, can now be reversed. Insofar as it is very obvious that certainly within our lifetimes or younger people's lifetimes, that cannot conceivably happen across the global, across the planet. We've got to come down to realizing that this puts an altogether different cast on policy for the future. We cannot now, we have left it too late, maybe 50 or 100 years too late, we cannot reverse that process. In those circumstances, we need to stop using the phrase carbon reduction when it is in fact a reduction on the rate of increase. We are all adding to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and because it is lower than it would otherwise be, that doesn't then add to the urgency with which we've got to reach zero carbon. You in North America...
keep me short.
I'll just finish on this one sentence. You in North America, for instance, as you know, have per capita emissions of something of the order of over 20 tonnes. We've got to get that down urgently to 0 tonnes because they are accumulating in the atmosphere. To make some sort of contribution to that still leaves huge amounts of carbon being emitted to the atmosphere. How can you be so hopeful about the future in these circumstances?
Okay, and Kate.
Thank you. Kate Rawls, University of Cumbria and Outdoor Philosophy. Huge thanks for that, Naomi Klein, and for your inspiration over the years. My question is about power. I think, how do we make sure that we don't just transfer power from one group to another group, or one set of people to another set of peoples, but also radically transform the nature of power so that it remains or becomes a force for the good?
Right. Did you hear those, Naomi? Do you want me to repeat them?
I need you to repeat them. I'm actually trying to call up the live stream on my other computer because I think that I'll be able to hear it that way. But I'm having some trouble. So Kevin, I do need you to repeat it.
Okay, I've just been told by John, who's waving his hands frantically, do not join the live stream. I'm not sure why that is. I'm just relaying the message. And that's what I'm going to do. So if you can hear me, I will relay both Mayor Hillman's question, as I understand it, and Kate Rawls' question. I think I'm looking at Mayor as well, so he can shake his head if I'm not interpreting him correctly. I think he was asking how, given that we've emitted so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, how can you make...
Kevin, I can't hear you.
Okay, I think we might try
Kevin, I cannot hear you.
Okay, we'll try the phone. Can you see? No, I can't see him either. That's probably a good thing.
Hello?
Are you there? I'm on the phone now. Wonderful. Right now, it was more like
well, at least it worked during the speech.
It did. It was very clear, actually.
Great.
Right. So Mayor Hillman's question was, if I am interpreting this correctly, was that given that we've pumped so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, how can you remain so hopeful that we can actually do something about these challenges, and that in fact almost the language that we're using around carbon reduction misunderstands that we've already locked the future into such high levels of climate change. So the impression I got was more of a sense of hopelessness from Mayor, and yet you were giving a message more of one of hope. And I think you'd like to see how you'd respond to that, where you think some hope is there, and why you feel more hopeful than clearly Mayor does. And the second question was from Kate Rawls, was that how do we ensure that we don't just move power from one group to another group? How can we instead make power work probably for all of us in a more egalitarian, in a better fashion? Was that a fair interpretation? Yes, so they're the two questions.
All right, those are great questions. I'm going to put down the phone for a sec, but I'll keep the line open.
Yeah, okay? Yeah, that's good.
So, I mean, I've always felt that the hopefulness is it's kind of a choice, and I mean, in some sense, if we don't have hope that we can change things somehow, then why are any of us having this conversation or in the room? You know, why aren't we just, off enjoying the last, bits of nature? So I think we all make that choice. And I sort of feel like if you can't maintain some optimism that's credible, then you should stop. You should take yourself out of any kind of leadership role, and not spread despair, because it's contagious. Just as hope is contagious. That said, I'm not saying we can stop this. I make the argument that one of the reasons why climate action is such a threat to neoliberalism is because it demands that we reinvest in the commons immediately and on a huge scale, right? I mean, Andrew talked about the model of the Green New Deal. I don't think we want it to be as status as the original New Deal, but I do think that we need to think on that scale of action, even if it's more about multiplying local solutions, and that comes to the second question, which I'll get to in a second. But that investment in the public sphere is for two reasons, right? I mean, one is that we need to invest in the public sphere in order to lower emissions, and that's what this conference is focused on, And so the classic example of that is just huge investments in public transit, for instance, and massive investments in the kind of construction that will lower emissions and insulation and so on, and efficiency. But we also need to invest in the public sphere because we've already locked ourselves into so much heavy weather, and we can't get out of that. And coming back to the Katrina example, what we see time and time again is that a weak, neglected public sphere makes us tremendously more vulnerable to climate change. So this shift in values is necessary just for dealing with the climate change that we've already unleashed, and not just in terms of the sort of bones of our infrastructure to protect us from the storm, but also the shift in values in terms of taking care of one another, and having strong communities that comes from rebuilding our local economies, as well as valuing things other than shopping. Bill McKibben talked about how the best adaptation to climate change that you can make is to live somewhere that has a strong sense of community, because that will be your best protection more than any infrastructure investment you can make. We're living in a society where people look after each other. And that's not the kind of society that we have. So that values shift that I'm talking about relates to adaptation, as well as mitigation, to use the jargon. So I hope that answers the hope question. I'm not a fan of silly hope, and I think we've had a lot of silly hope in the climate movement of just like, you can change the world by, changing your light bulb and, changing how much water you put in the kettle and so on. And I think that sort of stuff has depleted the credibility of the climate discourse, because the scale of the threat does not mesh up with the ask. We're not asking enough of people in the face of the sense of alarm that we're raising. Those two things have to be, have to be at the same scale. In terms of how we don't replicate the power structures, that's where that decentralization comes in, and I think why it is so important not to just think about replacing fossil fuels with large-scale corporate wind and solar. And I think it's really interesting how you see so much more buy-in for renewable energy where it's more democratic, where communities have more control over renewable energy, where they have more direct benefit but also more direct say. As soon as these power projects are seen as an outside force that benefit a small elite, you have this populist outrage against them, which we can all get very frustrated about. Why are they so angry about wind, but they're putting up with fossil fuels and so on and so on. But what you actually see is that decentralization and democratization, deep participatory democracy, are our best chance of getting the shift in energy sources that we need. But it's also guarding against replicating these power structures. And renewable energy happens to be much more conducive to decentralization and democratization than fossil fuels. Just because it's conducive, however, does not mean that it will necessarily happen. You can do renewables, in a very top-down, corporatist way, but you don't have to. Whereas I think you really can't do fossil fuels democratically. So that we have working for us.
Okay. Thank you very much, Naomi. Any more questions? There's one right at the back there, and then one at the front here. So we could go to the person at the back first, please.
Hi, this is John Weiss from your southerly border neighbor of Minnesota. Thanks for all of your comments, Miss Naomi. I left in a blizzard, and thankfully it's beautiful in London. Look, it's a climate crisis of catastrophic proportions. I think most of us agree with that. But in terms of the climate politics, you really are articulate. And maybe one way of looking at this is the way that I look at it, at least, is a climate crisis is a huge, enormous global opportunity. It's an opportunity to match developed and developing country ambitions around mutuality, redefine even democracy in terms of justice, climate justice. It's just an opportunity. So I was wondering if you can speak a bit about how the climate crisis can be seen also rhetorically in climate politics as an opportunity. I look at market mechanisms for economic development of evergreen development as the platform. Thanks, Naomi.
Okay, and Clive?
Yeah, Clive Spash, Vienna University of Economics and Business. I'm interested if you could just say something about the censorship that goes on, that is increasing. I suffer censorship in Australia. I understand Canada is now clamping down on free speech, clamping down on civil servants and scientists and so on. And I'm concerned that actually, while we're trying to increase the debate and progress the debate, and you're certainly a voice in that debate, actually a lot of people are suffering as a result of this and are actually scared to say anything. The scientists are scared to talk about their values, the researchers are scared to talk out, the climate denialists are scaring people with threats, and in Australia with threats of life and family. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Okay, Naomi, I take it you didn't hear those.
No.
Oh no, okay, right, I'll do my best again. And the first one was from John Rice, who's from Minnesota, and he was asking, or proposing that the climate crisis could be seen as, I think the language he used was a massive opportunity, and particularly for, if I understood it, the developing, the industrializing countries in terms of introducing more democracy and more development and more renewable energy. So I think he was saying, could it be seen as a massive opportunity, quite in contrast to Mayer in the previous question. And then there also, I think he said that he thought market mechanisms were probably the platform for delivering on that. And the next speaker the next question was Clive Spash.
He said he thinks that the market mechanisms are the best way to do it.
Was that broadly correct? Platform for doing it? Okay. Okay. Yeah, market mechanisms that would link the developed and the developing world, as he calls them, probably for moving monies. I'm making a guess here, moving resources from the developed to the developing world to help them in the process of development, democracy, and more renewable, low carbon energy. And then the second person was Clive Spash, who I think I'd be fair to say would probably disagree with the idea of market mechanisms as being the main driver there. And he was asking about the concept of censorship, whether you were seeing a lot more censorship of academics, of civil servants, of scientists, and that many of us actually are scared to speak out, and that there's almost an institutional level of sort of censorship that is going on, and whether you're seeing that in Canada, and if you could comment on that. So they're the 2 points. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll start with Clive's question, which, in Canada it's become terrifying, and I think in Britain you guys are sort of at the beginning process, from what I can tell from here, where the chill is setting in, particularly as this coalition government decides to make its dash for gas come hell or high water, and I think there's an incredible the language of the lack of consent is really ubiquitous, and this is why I think a lot of these extraction battles ultimately come down to being battles about what democracy fundamentally means. Because, in Canada, we have a prime minister who he traveled to Washington recently to promote the Keystone XL pipeline, despite the fact that there's tremendous opposition to it, despite the fact that it's under environmental review, and said, we won't take no for an answer. He said that at a press conference. We will not take no for an answer about this tar sands pipeline. And that's basically been the message to everyone. We won't take no for an answer. And in Canada, our government has one idea, which for economic development, which is just dig lots and lots of holes and pipe it out onto boats, and that's the plan. And the tar sands have largely protected Canada from the economic downturn that has spread throughout Europe. So this is their economic plan. It's the only idea they have. They're terrified that if they are slowed down in their extractivist agenda, then they'll have an economic crisis on their hands. So they are just eliminating everyone who stands in their way. So they've attacked environmentalists. Environmentalists are under increasing surveillance. They're being tasked as foreign agents, and First Nations people, Indigenous people in Canada are also facing a renewed wave of attacks on their rights, which is why we've seen a very strong response in Canada of Indigenous groups with the rise of the I Don't Know More movement. And so I just say all of this because the attacks on scientists, which I think we've all heard about, Canadian scientists are under attack as they have never been in their history. And for me as a journalist, trying to just get basic information that you would think is not all that controversial, like just speaking to a polar bear expert who can tell you what's going on with the polar bear reproduction. No one will talk. Right? It's just been unbelievably hard to get scientists on the phone. and they're terrified. They're terrified of losing their jobs, and it's a rightful fear. But I think it's a mistake to look at the attacks on scientists in isolation from the attacks on every obstacle to this agenda, right? Because it's very important for scientists, in order to build the type of movement that will allow you guys to protect yourselves, you need to make common cause with the other people who are being silenced and vilified, and those are activists, indigenous people, farmers, anybody standing in the way. So you're not special. It's part of this pattern. In terms of the question of whether this can be a tremendous opportunity, you know, I'll be honest with you, you know, I think as most of you know, my history is not in climate activism. I've been engaged with this issue pretty continuously since 2009 or 2008. But before that, I was really focused on economic justice issues, and I still am. But I do believe that a science-based response to the climate threat is our best lever to achieve economic justice, both at home, within our countries, and internationally between countries. That I believe that this science can be a tool to heal centuries-old colonial wounds. And you know, the issue of historical responsibility is the defining issue of climate negotiations. It's what the talks always break down over. It's the center of the debate, and ultimately, you know, it's intimately connected to colonialism, to the ecological debt that we owe to the global South, starting with colonialism. But these debts have always been kind of too amorphous for us to really rally around and achieve concrete victories. I think climate debt is different. And the fact that we need to have an agenda that provides an alternate development path for the so-called developing world, the fact that we need that for our own stability, the fact that our fates are so clearly interconnected, provides us with the real opportunity. That it isn't just out of the goodness of our hearts. It's that without that equity, without that redistribution of technology, of resources, without that historical accounting, right? I mean, I come from a part of the world that really doesn't like to look at the past, but climate change demands that we look at the past. All of this is an opportunity, you know, and I don't mean to be sanguine about it. I don't think it's all good news. I think there's a huge amount of hardship embedded in this. But I think that there is a path forward that provides these opportunities. I don't think that it is going to be, you know, market mechanisms like, you know, offsets and carbon trading that's going to get us there. I think it's more likely going to be something like a global feed-in tariff that's going to provide us with the redistribution resources. Because what we can't afford is for gains in the global South to be undone by the fact that we're continuing to burn fossil fuels in the North. We don't have enough time for that. So I think that sort of rules out what we thought of as market mechanisms up till now, anyway.
Okay, Naomi, that was really good answers to those questions. I got a thumbs up from the one at the back as well there. But more importantly, I was getting another sort of signal from Carly at the front here, who's our, what would you call yourself, Carly? Our boss for the day, our compere for the day. And she's told me that from a time point of view, we've run out of time, we've got to go into the next session. So I would like to thank you from everyone here. Thank you for an inspiring, thought-provoking and challenging keynote. It's given us all something to think about over the next 2 days, but probably more importantly to thank you also for your ongoing work on climate change. And as a plug, when's your new book out?
Not till September.
September.
But thank you so much, Kevin, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Right, thanks very much, and thanks from all of us here. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
the concept and explain the mechanisms by which we think the idea of personal carbon trading and personal carbon allowances could work, could sort of affect change. I'm going to summarise the research evidence and talk about some new research that's happening at the moment, which is quite interesting. And then I'm going to finish by suggesting how can we take this idea forward? Where does it, if it's going to go from a sort of academic idea into a policy mechanism, what needs to happen? How might that happen? Personal carbon trading is really a sort of umbrella term that includes a number of different particular schemes. It's an idea, I suppose, for a national way of capping and reducing carbon emissions in an equitable way. And it has been, certainly some of the schemes have been very much inspired by contraction and convergence, which, as many of you probably know, is a global mechanism for reducing and sharing out the sort of reduction in carbon emissions globally. And this is a sort of national working out of it. And within the sort of umbrella of personal carbon trading, there's a number of different boundaries that people take. So, for example, we heard earlier about tradable energy quotas, which are essentially a type of personal carbon trading, but bigger because it includes the rest of the economy as well. But there's sort of a number of variations. And the one I'm going to be sort of focusing on is one that it looks at reducing carbon emissions from personal transport and household energy use. So I'm not going out to the whole boundary of the economy like tradable energy quotas does. In this talk, I'm talking about this smaller boundary, which is about between 40 and 50% of the carbon emissions from our economy, not including imported goods. And the idea is that everybody gets an equal allowance. It will be a reducing annual allowance, signalled well in advance. It'll cover the types of energy I've just talked about. It's mandatory, and there'll be an electronic accounting system. So the idea would be every time you, I don't know, paid your electricity bill, you'd also have to pay a certain amount of carbon credits to cover the carbon. And if you hadn't got them, you would have to buy additional carbon credits in some way. And the reason that this mechanism has got trading in it is really for the reason that at the moment, if we look at personal emissions from transport and household energy together, there's a huge variation between individuals. If you tried to set a ration level, let's say, that people could live within without having any trading, you would have to set it so high, probably, as to be ineffective. I did a small sample of, 35 people looking at their emissions, and there was a factor of 10 different between them for these two things, and that was just a small sample. So there's this huge variation, which is the reason that trading is in here. It's not because we think trading is a marvellous prerequisite, or that it's about trading. It's not about trading, it's about reducing emissions in an equitable way that's socially acceptable. And as part of that, we think trading would be needed. How would it work? Well, it's got a number of mechanisms that we've proposed by which it would work. And there's an economic mechanism, obviously, because it's a way of putting a price on carbon. So there's that sort of economic signal that you're going to get. But it's not just economics. This is not just a fancy way of doing a carbon tax that's a bit more complicated. I think it's got a lot more going for it than that. It's also about increasing carbon perception. So if you've got this sort of system whereby everybody has to have a carbon account and has to think about their carbon when they're making energy decisions, then you're going to have a lot more visibility of carbon in society. It's something that's going to be at the front of mind for people. I mean, as energy researchers always complain that one of the problems about energy is that it's invisible. People can't really understand it, they can't grasp it, and therefore it's not an important thing. People don't want energy, they want the services and so on. Well, carbon, the problem's even worse than that because you don't even get a bill for it. So this is all about raising the importance of carbon in people's minds and making it something that they pay attention to when they make decisions. I think the third mechanism we're thinking about is beyond the individual, and it's about the social environment and social norms. And if what we're saying to people is, okay, this year's carbon allowance is whatever it is, 4.5 tonnes of carbon or whatever the number is, then everybody knows that's the normal level that you're supposed to be at. Okay, your emissions might be a lot higher at the moment because you live in a big inefficient house, or you've got an old car, or you've got this and that lifestyle. But that's the social expectations of what the average should be for our society. And that's a powerful message to people about what matters and what you should be doing. There's been, over the past 10 or so years, there's been, a fair amount of research on this. My research was funded by the UK Energy Research Centre. There has been research that was done at the Royal Society of Arts. There's various, Tyndall have done research on it. There's various sort of research organisations who've got involved. There's been some government-sponsored research. There's been quite a lot of student-based, quite a lot of master's theses and some PhDs on this. So that's where this research is coming from that I'm talking about. And I'd say where we've got to is, I think in theory, some variety of PCT is a serious alternative to increased energy taxation. We've got some understanding of the institutions and the systems that would be needed and how you would manage it and how you would enforce it. What we know from modelling, by looking at data on income and energy use and turning that into carbon emissions, is that personal carbon trading should be a progressive policy. In other words, that it will hit the richer harder than the poorer, because not surprisingly, those of us who are richer have higher carbon emissions, mostly because we travel more. But some poorer individuals will be worse off. And this has been done in quite a lot of detail by CSE, the Centre for Sustainable Energy in Bristol. And, and that's because of this problem of variability that I mentioned before, that all right, while carbon emissions may rise on average as you go up the income scale, actually the variations within a particular income band are much greater than the differences between average people in different bands. So you've got this huge variability. So of course that's an important issue. There's been quite a lot of research on acceptability. Would it be socially acceptable? This is one of the big questions that always comes up, not surprisingly. And there's been sort of research that's done, looked at focus groups, questionnaires, opinion polls. There's been various sorts of research. And what you find is, and this holds true across all these different kinds of research, if you give people the choice between personal carbon trading and increased carbon taxation, more people say they prefer personal carbon trading. Of course, if you give them the choice between doing nothing at all and personal carbon trading, they prefer nothing at all. Okay, but that, we all know that problem. So the point is, the initial research doesn't show this is necessarily less acceptable than alternatives. It just may be doing anything really radical at the moment is, as we know, not terribly acceptable. The technology isn't a problem. We know that technology to do this kind of thing exists. And, another finding, if you're comparing this with taxation, which is what the historical comparison has been, clearly this is, it's going to be a bit more costly. And what you think about that depends on what you think about the benefits that it could deliver. And as I was trying to sort of indicate, the additional social and psychological mechanisms it could bring in. Current research. I think the one thing I'll say is there's an interesting trial happening in Australia at the moment in an island called Norfolk Island, which is a little island about 2,000 kilometres or 1,500 kilometres off the coast. They've got 350 people registered. They've got a carbon accounting system. When you go and fill up your car with petrol, you sort of, you use your carbon card. They're working with the energy suppliers as well. So it's a really interesting system and sort of trial, and it'd be interesting to see how it goes and what people think about it. And what's really interesting is how it was democratically agreed that this island was going to trial this system. There's been a very consensual process. And I think that would be good to see what happens. The bad news is there's very little other funded research going on at the moment, certainly that I know of. What next? Well, I think, as we all know, bright ideas don't necessarily make it into policy. That's quite hard. And what would it need to take these suite of ideas from being bright ideas into something that's actually going to happen? And I think the conclusion I've got to is that it needs some kind of bottom-up support, because there was a moment in 2006, 7, 8 where there was some top-down political focus from the then Environment Secretary and the government on this idea, and they looked at it and they dismissed it, and there was no support base to say, but hang on, we're really interested in this, and what about the good points? So it's my feeling that in various ways this idea needs to gain more supporters, and that's partly what I'm hoping will happen today. Just in a smaller picture, Mayor Hillman and I wrote a book about this, which was published almost 10 years ago, and we're trying to reinvigorate the debate by producing something, not necessarily a book, for next year, which will be the 10-year anniversary. So if anybody's interested in being involved in that process or making a contribution, that would be great. We'd be glad to hear from you. So just to conclude, I think that personal carbon trading is a really powerful and inspirational idea. It's not just an economic mechanism. It's about talking about reducing, it's about talking about fairness, it's talking about shares, it's talking about getting everybody involved in this process of reduction and getting social consent for that. I think it encourages discussion about winners and losers, and it's going to be quite open about, well, who might win and who might lose and what are we going to do about that, and you know, how much unfairness can we put up with. I think it certainly questions the capability of the current policy toolkit to develop, to do change. It doesn't say this is the only policy we need. As well as this policy, you need to carry on with all the things you're doing on efficiency and renewables and community action and all those things. But it's saying without some overall reduction mechanisms, those things on their own are not going to get us where we need to go. I think it could be translated into an acceptably equitable, effective and efficient policy. But I think researchers alone, you know, we can't do it on our own. And I think we need to take this idea out wider and get broader support or a broader debate about it if it's really going to make progress in the real world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tina. Now we're going to hear about a completely different group. Jaap Spier is going to talk to us about legal strategies. He comes from the Supreme Court of the Netherlands. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we desperately need to explore strategies that might work. And that's why this conference is so very important. There is an emerging debate about the role the law could play in relation to climate change. Lawyers are strange animals. They tend to focus on solutions after the event, i.e. compensation. And strangely enough, also the international debate in the climate change negotiations is moving into that direction. Personally, I don't think that that is overly useful, if not for many other reasons, because it would mean that massive human suffering would have to materialize first before the law could come into play. I don't think that's the case, and it should not be the case. Conceptually, it is quite easy to paint a picture of the role the law could play. Why? It's actually quite easy. Climate change is about the most serious threat to humankind ever. That goes for present and even more for future generations. It's common ground in most countries, to the best of my knowledge, that posing others at avoidable significant risk is violation of the law. That goes for international law, that goes for human rights law, and that goes for private law. Even more so if the risk can be warded off at relatively modest cost. And that is the case. If we look at Lord Stern's calculations, it clearly follows that it is much, much cheaper to take effective measures right now instead of letting things happen. Seen from a legal angle, that in itself already points to very strict legal obligations to curb greenhouse gas emissions to a very significant extent. But there's more. It follows from the precautionary principle, I think, that we must depart from credible worst-case scenarios. Even a fairly remote chance that the 2 degrees Celsius threshold would be passed must be avoided. If, for example, IPCC takes the view that greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced by 4% annually, whereas other credible experts believe that it should be 6%, we should depart from the latter finding. And if we combine both legal imperatives, the obligation to avoid major losses and the precautionary principle, it belabours the obvious that quite a lot must be done seen from a legal angle. Emissions must be reduced at great pace and to a very significant extent. That goes for states, enterprises and society at large. For a number of reasons, the most vulnerable countries are not yet legally bound to reduce their emissions, at least not at their own expense. Their part of the cake has to be assumed by the remainder of states and enterprises. In many legal systems, courts can be called to aid in case of a threat of serious damage caused by unlawful activities by others. If states and enterprises don't meet their legal obligations, courts can issue injunctive relief. That means they can require defendants to meet their legal obligations. Admittedly, it won't be a walkover. A series of potential obstacles, such as the minimal contribution of almost all defendants, the political argument, i.e., this is a political issue that should not be dealt with by judges, will have to be removed. Not all courts around the globe will be courageous enough to step in, but a growing number of courts understand that they must act, and I'm quite sure they will. A focus on legal obligations entails more advantages. To mention a few, it strengthens the bargaining position of the vulnerable countries and the growing number of politicians willing to stem the tide. It can be used by enterprises to explain to their shareholders that they must act. Investors can, and would be well advised to do so, investors could urge their enterprises to meet their obligations. Supervisory institutions such as central banks could and should enter the scene. Climate change is, inter alia, about financial stability. They must secure that measures are taken to avoid a still avoidable economic collapse that will materialize if we stick to business as usual. I realize very well many hurdles will have to be taken. It will be an uphill fight, as almost every other solution is an uphill fight, but I quite strongly believe it can be done, and together with other solutions it might even work. Thank you very much. Legal system in question. It may well be a problem in some countries, it will probably not be in others. And then, yes, there definitely are legal scientists willing to provide legal advice, but the majority will probably be very reluctant due to, not surprisingly, vested legal interests. We've heard that more often today.
There's been a couple of people who've looked at the cost of if you were going to have a carbon account, carbon trading, personal carbon account system, what would it cost to set up the system and what would it cost to run each year? Now, unfortunately, I didn't do that research, so I don't remember the numbers that well. It's something like somewhere between £10 and £30 as a one-off cost per person, and something of a similar order running costs per year, and that's based around research on what does it cost to run basic bank accounts and what does it cost companies who run, like loyalty card schemes and so on. So, I mean, there's a bit of debate. The government came out with a higher set of figures, another set of researchers, I think IPPR, came out with a lower set of figures, but it's that sort of order. So whether you think that's significant or not probably depends on whether you like the idea or not, but it's not hundreds or thousands of pounds per person, it's tens.
Right, I'm just going to pause the questioning now and go over to Stefan Bogue. Can you...
Stefan, can you hear us there now?
I can't hear much. I can hear you, but not the others.
Yeah, that's fine. When it comes to Q&A, I'll come back up here, or Brenda can come to the lectern. But the floor is yours.
Okay. So should I speak now?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Sorry, say that again, please.
Yes, Stefan, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Oh, okay, I'm really sorry. This connection is not brilliant. So if you can hear me, then I'd like to introduce myself.
We can hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Stefan Byrne. I'm based at the University of Essex, just down the road from you, but unfortunately I'm currently in India on a research trip. And today I would like to talk to you about why I think, in my analysis, carbon markets are not worth the effort, because they will not bring about radical emissions reductions. And at the heart of the problem with carbon markets is what I would call the governance failure. Let me start with a paper by a colleague of mine, Jules Pretty, also based at Essex. He clearly shows that the Earth has already exceeded its capacity to supply source and sink resources. Consumption and population drivers continue to rise dramatically, which is particularly evident here in India. The population is set to rise to 1.6 billion by 2050. And just yesterday, I went to one of the glitzy shopping malls, and Indians are clearly trying to replicate the consumption patterns of the North. Now, if we all consume like the North Americans do, then I'm afraid we will run out of planets pretty quickly. As Johan Rockström and his colleagues from the Stockholm Resilience Institute clearly show, is that we are already overshooting some of the planetary boundaries, which means more resources are being used than can be regenerated each year. Yet, economic growth and rise of GDP are still primary political goals in most countries, including India. I'm sorry, yes. So growth is, the growth pattern is impossible to continue, and we know that the world and the planet is finite. What we also know is that carbon emissions are rapidly rising. Only in 2008 and 2009, when we had a massive economic degrowth story because of the financial and economic crisis, we've seen emissions fall. What we also know is that the IPCC tends to be quite conservative in its scenarios. So what we have to estimate is that emissions rises will be at the top end of the IPCC scenarios. So what I'm basically painting here, which you will be aware by now, is that we are in a pretty bleak situation. So despite this bleakness, what we have adopted is a policy that has so far failed to reduce emissions radically. Carbon markets are the world's preferred policy choice since at least 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was introduced. We all know why the Kyoto Protocol has been a failure, but what is often not talked about enough is that this carbon market, which are the preferred policy choice, and they were designed to be a global carbon market, yet of course that hasn't quite happened. The EU, however, has run a carbon market, the EU ETS, since 2005. So we have seen quite clearly how this market works or didn't work, and we see emissions rising even within the EU steadily. Despite the obvious failure to reduce emissions radically within the EU, we now see countries around the world replicating the carbon market policy, and this map provides a quick overview of which countries are currently either experimenting or actually implementing carbon markets. Now, here are 10 reasons why I think carbon markets have failed. Now, I've published a range of books and papers on this topic, which I invite you to look into in more detail. And this is certainly not just my analysis. Many analysts from around the world have shown and continue to show the shortcomings of carbon markets. So this is a short summary of some of the reasons why they have huge failures. And here I'm particularly focusing on the clean development mechanism, which is one of the carbon market mechanisms under Kyoto. I'm just in India, as I said, and yesterday I spoke to a carbon trader who confirmed again that most of the CDM projects here are non-additional, i.e. they are actually business as usual, which means they're just extra profit, providing extra profit opportunity rather than really reducing emissions overall. As I've shown, and many others have shown in their analysis, there's a lot of corruption in the market, and these markets have really been captured by elites in both north and south. In the EU, we have seen windfall profits for fossil fuel industries, and even Conor Hedegaard, the EU commissioner responsible for the ETS, says that many projects, particularly in CDM, lack environmental integrity. Here on the ground, when you actually go to the communities that are affected by CDM projects, one can easily see that youth service is being paid to sustainable development, to community involvement, and there's often a complete lack of accountability and transparency. But overall, what is clear to see is that the carbon price, currently where it is, right in the bottom, provides no signal whatsoever for companies to invest in low carbon technologies. So the argument is that carbon markets allow the north to look relatively green, while the south, particularly in India, as I've seen it myself, already is suffering from climate change. One other thing that is often not discussed is that the whole Kyoto Protocol is based on assumption, or is based on a reduction focus rather than a consumption focus. We all know that a lot of Chinese and Indian and Brazilian production is actually geared towards the consumption of the north. Here is a graph of the carbon credit price. Just yesterday, an Indian carbon trader told me the current CER price is a complete joke. It is currently just over €0. So the price signal doesn't work whatsoever. Here's a company I've researched quite intensively. It's an industrial gas company here in Gujarat in India. The analysis I've done shows that excessive profits are being made with the CDM. There's been a lot of corruption, yet the local community continues to have negative health impacts, and the sustainability measures are negative as well. A student of mine here in India currently researches Indian wind farms. Now, on the face of it, they're more sustainable and they're green. And but looking at the situation more clearly, one sees very quickly that again these are business as usual projects, i.e. non-additional. Why? Because the Indian government currently subsidizes wind farms heavily, so they are being built regardless of the CDM because there's subsidy, and even the state government in Gujarat subsidizes them on top of the government subsidy. And the CDM is then the third source of profit and revenue for these companies. So in a way, what the Indian trader told me, it's a no-brainer to build these wind farms, but they're certainly not additional. Now, why do I talk about a government failure? Over the years, I've worked with this, what I would call a magic triangle, to try to understand climate governance, and many others, like Matt Patterson and Peter Mill, have also worked with a similar Gramscian approach, which argues that in order to achieve social, economic, and political outcomes, that government, civil society, and industry have to be aligned in a certain way to provide a kind of a regime of political economy. What I'm arguing here is that this triangle has been dominated dominated by the commercial exchange between industry and civil society. And we have seen a de-emphasis of the regulatory and political exchange. In fact, one could draw this triangle and this diagram more dramatically, saying that the commercial exchange is actually dominating this triangle. It's dominating the regulatory exchange and the political exchange. And carbon markets are testament to that logic. So in other words, neoliberal market mechanisms of any sort are dominating government and civil society, which I would argue is one of the primary sources of why exactly we are now reaching the planetary boundaries. It's the imbalance in this triangle that leads to the negative sustainability outcome. So my message is fairly simple and fairly clear. If we want to see radical emissions reductions, we need to rebalance government. We need to take power away from the commercial exchange, and we need to repower political exchanges and regulatory exchanges. In the Indian context, which I've learned a lot about just over the last 2 weeks, that means local and state governments have to increase their capacity to not just regulate and issue laws, but also implement them and supervise commercial exchanges. Equally, the role of civil society, social movements, NGOs needs to be strengthened so that they can keep government and industry in check. So my argument is, if you want to deal with climate change, if you want to radically reduce emissions, you need to start with governance and rebalancing governance. Thank you very much for having me. I hope you have been able to hear what I have said, and I look forward to some questions if I can hear them. Thank you very much.
Just to the stay there. Just for the ease of this process, perhaps we could just have a couple of questions specifically for Stefan, and then we can relay those to him, and then we'll come back to the other two with further questions. So I've got one gentleman right at the back there. Anybody else got a question specifically for Stefan? And the other microphone here, please. Right, please stand and tell us who you are. And
James Atkins from Vertis Finance. This is more a brief observation. There were 10 reasons given why carbon markets don't work. I think they might apply to CDM, but I think of those only about 2 apply to the European Union trading scheme. So I think even though I'm also not a great fan of carbon markets, despite working in them, I think you have to be fair when you criticise them, and I don't think those 10 points were fair.
right, and the other question?
Thanks, Kate Rawls. Stefan, I really loved the analysis. I'd be really interested to know your top tips for how we can strengthen the political sphere in the way you recommend.
Okay, Stefan, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but I'm afraid I didn't hear any of the comments or questions.
That's fine. I'll do my best to relay them, and apologies to the question askers. The first question was an observation first that the 10 criticisms of carbon markets that you put up, 8 of them applied predominantly to the clean development mechanism, but only 2 of them applied to the EU ETS. And the speaker wondered if you could respond to that. And then the second question asked about political transformation. How to strengthen the political sphere, as you put forward at the end.
Okay. It's a fair comment. Most of my, about EU ETS versus CDM, most of my research has been into the CDM, except that the carbon price is clearly linked to the development in the EU ETS as well, and there's been plenty of critiques of regulatory capture in the EU ETS as well. colleagues like Larry Lohman and others have provided ample critique of the EU ETS as well. So many of the things I presented here equally apply to the EU ETS. How to strengthen the political exchange? Well, that's a big one, of course, but clearly what we see now happening in terms of the democratic process is often not working. We see a fall in voting numbers. We see less access of people to politicians as regulation and government has been captured by commercial interests. How to rebalance that? I don't know. Obviously, civil society has to empower itself, because they will not be empowered, in my view, by government or industry. So grassroots action is the only way forward in my assessment.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stefan.
Tell him that that's
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah, that's
Thanks
it,
very
Stefan. If you'd like to rejoin the web stream when you leave WebEx, you'll be able to hear the rest of the proceedings.
Great. Thank you very much. Good luck with the conference. Thank you.
Right. Any more questions about the role of personal carbon trading or our legal communities? I've got two on this side, one in the middle and one at further back. Yep.
Hello. Thank you, Roger Martin, Population Matters. Could I ask Tina, given that Kofi Annan, in his key recommendations at the Global Humanitarian Forum a couple of years ago, made the point about contraction and convergence, saying that this, with a population base year, should be the basis for climate equity. How do you feature population growth into the PCT system, given that every additional person on the planet, and there are about 3 per second or 10,000 per hour, is in fact reducing everybody else's sustainable carbon ration? It's also the case, of course, that measures to reduce future demand through population measures are considerably cheaper than any of the renewable technologies sometimes put forward. So it is the low-growing fruit that somehow or other politicians in the climate talks have failed to pick. Thank you.
Thank you. The other question, please.
Thanks, Brenda.
Can you stand so we can hear you properly?
Tom Rushby from the University of Southampton. It's a question directly for Tina. You mentioned public acceptability in your presentation. Now, I think I'm right in saying that the studies into public acceptability also show that there's an appreciation that a fair share isn't necessarily an equal per capita share. I just wondered if you wanted to comment a bit on that.
Okay. I mean, to start with the issue around population, I suppose because personal carbon trading and allowances has mostly been explored in a UK context. Thinking about population hasn't really been part of thinking about this particular policy. I mean, in a sense, the policy is about setting a national cap and then sharing that up equally or fairly or in some way between the population that we have, and we haven't really, clearly as the population grows, then each individual is going to have a smaller share than they would do if the population didn't grow. But I think beyond that, there hasn't really been much consideration about the role of population within these schemes. I mean, probably there's been more discussion about the role of what rights do children have and what allowances do children have and how you balance that against the rights of adults. And that there's been a bit of debate about that, but not so much about thinking about population, I suppose, because we're based in a country with pretty low population growth. It hasn't been a big part of the debate. I mean, I'm not a philosopher. I mean, people who have got much more of a philosophical background have written quite extensively about the different kinds of fairness and the different kinds of equity that you have, and whether that's, I mean, I'm not an expert on that. I would say that that's right. When people have done focus groups and probed in more depth about people who either for or against personal carbon allowances compared with the taxation system, fairness is often the key thing that they're arguing about, and what they think would be fair, and whether they think this system would be fairer than an alternative system. And there are other concerns. There's concerns about would people cheat, and there are concerns about what would it cost and would it be effective and all that kind of thing. But sort of a debate about what it means to have a fair system is really at the heart of how people respond to these policies. And clearly you can have a lot of argument. Just because people get an equal allowance doesn't mean it's fair. People would have to respond very differently if they wanted to live within that allowance, depending on the efficiency of the home, how far their job is located from where they live, how many people live in their house. There's all sorts of things that means our individual circumstances mean our carbon emissions can be very different from each other, even without us, jetting off all over the world, just leading modest lives. We can end up with very different emissions from each other. And all of that is true. But if you start, and so some people would say you need to have a system where you need equal effort, people need to be equally reducing. The idea of thinking about trying to turn that into a workable policy just seems to me almost impossible. As we know from this debate about withdrawing child benefit from higher rate taxpayers, there was a debate about, well, that's not really fair, because you could have two earner families who are just below the higher rate tax rate, who have much higher joint income, and yet they're not losing their benefits. But the government decided, no, this is fair enough, it will do, and it's a simple system and we can implement it. And I think that's the strength of saying equal per capita allowances. It's fair enough. It's certainly not perfectly fair, but what is?
Right, I've got one more question here on the aisle. Anybody? Mayor has got one. As you've already asked for one, Mayor, have you asked a question?
Yes.
Oh. Anybody not asked a question who wants to? Get some more democracy in here. All right, here we are. We've got one just on the other side of the aisle. We'll just have those two first, please.
Daniel Schaaf from Greenspeed. I've got a poster for you to quiz me on. It's a question for the lawyer amongst us. Very encouraged to see a lawyer here. I'm about to leave my firm. They have an environmental policy which they don't implement. Should I walk out, or should I sue them for constructive dismissal and create a storm by some legal process and show trial?
Thank you. The other question here. Do you understand?
Christian Heitsch, Brunel University. I'm also a lawyer. I've got a question for Jaap Spiers and a couple of comments meant to supplement what he had said. My question is about injunctive relief. In order to obtain injunctive relief, one would have to make a prima facie case that a specific defendant's emissions are likely to cause harm to the plaintiff's enjoyment of their property or something like that. And it would seem to be quite difficult to establish causation between, let's say, the emissions caused by ExxonMobil and the coastal erosion at Kivalina in Alaska, which was the subject matter of a case in the United States, which got thrown out over jurisdictional issues. But how would you address the causation issue? My comments relate to other possible legal avenues. There was an example up in Scotland, the Falkirk Community Charter, where a community, based on a very imaginative reading of the Localism Act 2011, created a charter defining biodiversity and things like that as community assets or assets of community value, with a view to slowing down the process of fracking being permitted, of fracking companies obtaining development consent. Also, there now is at the EU level the European Citizens Initiative, which enables citizens from all over the EU to request the Commission to make a legislative proposal. This might be a device to implement or to make the EU consider a viable, for instance, personal carbon trade scheme.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
The first question was a gentleman who's leaving his job, the extent to which he's leaving it because his firm has an environmental policy that it is not implementing, was left in the air a bit. But as he's leaving, could he take the company to court for constructive dismissal and have a show trial? That was his question to you. So those are your two questions here.
Well, first question is terribly difficult. It is too difficult to answer straight away. I really would have to think about that. I'm not suggesting that I'm not willing to answer it, but it's that complicated that I should allow myself more time. The second is easier. Let me start with the final observation. Well, given that politicians do such a bad job, I would be very surprised if any attempt to bring them to their senses is very promising. And then your question, which is basically about causation. Well, that might be a problem. I would need quite some time to explain that in some detail, but I quite strongly believe that the problem can be overcome. But I can't give any guarantee. You are very right, it is a potential hurdle and it might not be taken. But there have been many more instances in the past where remote chances did suffice to create liability. Well, if that's the case, it's not that easy to understand why that would be fundamentally different here, but that said, you have a point.
Thank you very much. I think we've now, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop now because we're, thanks to Naomi's wonderful talk and our questions, we're a bit behind schedule. We're now going to have a tea break. You've got 20 minutes. So you've got to have a quick cup of tea. So come back at 25 to, and now I'd like you just to join me in thanking Tina, Jaap and Stefan.